When Jake's grandfather passed away at 87, he left behind more than just memories. The old man had spent his entire life working a cattle ranch that sprawled across 1,500 acres of untouched wilderness. Rolling hills covered in wild grass, dense forests where deer roamed freely, and right in the middle of it all sat the crown jewel, a massive, private lake so clear you could see 20 feet down into the water. Jake was 34 years old and working as an environmental consultant in the city when he got the news. He'd visited his grandfather's ranch every summer as a kid, swimming in that lake and riding horses across those hills. Those were some of the best memories of his childhood. Now all of it belonged to him. The lawyer handling the estate told Jake that his grandfather had been very specific in his will. He wanted the land to stay wild, untouched by developers who'd been trying to buy it for decades. The old man had turned down offers that would have made him a millionaire several times over. He always said the land wasn't for sale at any price. It had been in the family for 40 years, and he wanted it to stay that way. Jake felt the weight of that responsibility, but he also felt honored. He planned to keep his grandfather's wishes. Maybe he'd eventually build a small cabin there, spend weekends away from the city, but mostly he'd let nature do its thing. No strip malls, no housing developments, just land the way it was meant to be. He took a week off work to drive out and see the property. It was a 6-hour drive from the city, and with every mile that passed, Jake felt the stress of his daily life melting away. When he finally turned onto the dirt road that led to the ranch, his heart was pounding with anticipation, but what he found there made his stomach drop. As Jake drove closer to the lake, he started seeing things that definitely weren't there during his last visit 5 years ago. First, there was a paved road where there used to be just a dirt trail. Then he spotted a fancy wooden sign that read, Lakeside Estates Private Community. His confusion turned to shock when he crested the hill and saw the lake. The shoreline was completely transformed. There were docks everywhere, at least a dozen of them, jutting out into the water like fingers. Expensive boats bobbed in the water, the kind that cost more than most people's houses. Someone had built a massive pavilion with a roof and picnic tables right on the beach. There was even a floating platform out in the middle of the lake with diving boards attached. Jake pulled over and just sat there, staring. This was his land. His grandfather's land. What the hell was all this stuff doing here? He got out of his truck and walked down to the shore. The beach area had been completely redone with imported sand. There were lounge chairs scattered around, a volleyball net, even a tiki bar that looked like it hadn't been used recently. Off to the right, he could see a row of boathouses, each one bigger than a regular garage. A woman in expensive athletic wear was jogging along a trail that ran beside the lake. When she saw Jake, she slowed down and pulled out her earbuds. "Can I help you?" she asked. And there was something defensive in her tone, like Jake was the one who didn't belong there. "I'm Jake," he said. "I own this land." The woman's face went from suspicious to confused. "You own what land?" "All of it. The lake, the shoreline, everything you're standing on right now." She laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "I don't think so. This is Lakeside Estates. My husband and I paid $8 million for our home here, specifically because of the lake access. We own this." Jake felt his face getting hot. "Ma'am, I just inherited this property from my grandfather. I've got the deed in my truck. This lake has been in my family for 40 years. The woman's smile disappeared. "You need to leave. This is private property. I'm calling security." She pulled out her phone, and Jake decided it wasn't worth the argument right then. He walked back to his truck, his mind racing. $8 million? Lake access? What was she talking about? He drove around the perimeter of his property and discovered something that made the situation even worse. There was an entire neighborhood built on the land adjacent to his. And calling it a neighborhood didn't really do it justice. These were mansions, the kind of places that show up in magazines about how rich people live. Each house was massive, with perfectly manicured lawns and circular driveways. He counted 47 homes in total. Every single one of them had been built to face the lake. His lake. The one on his property. Jake parked near what looked like a community center and went inside. There was a woman at the front desk who greeted him with a professional smile. "Welcome to Lakeside Estates. Are you here for the property tour?" "No," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge here. The HOA president or the property manager, someone like that." The woman's smile flickered. "May I ask what this is regarding?" It's regarding the fact that your entire community has built structures on my land without permission. The smile disappeared completely. Please wait here. She picked up the phone and had a hushed conversation that Jake couldn't quite hear. A few minutes later, a man in his 60s came out. He was tall, tan, and had the kind of confidence that comes from having money and being used to getting his way. I'm Richard Patterson, he said, not offering his hand. President of the Lakeside Estates HOA, and you are? Jake Morrison. I just inherited the 1,500 acres that include the lake your community has been using. Richard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I see. Well, Mr. Morrison, I think there's been some confusion. The lake access rights were negotiated with the previous property owner years ago. My grandfather never mentioned any agreement to me. It was all handled legally and properly, Richard said smoothly. The original developer of Lakeside Estates secured an easement for lake access. All of our homeowners purchased their properties with the explicit understanding that they would have full access to the lake. That was the primary selling point of this community. Jake felt like he was missing something important here. Okay, well, I'd like to see that easement agreement. And we need to talk about all these structures that have been built. The docks, the pavilion, the boathouses. I never gave permission for any of that. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. As I said, it was all arranged with the previous owner. I'm sure if you review the estate documents carefully, you'll find everything in order. My grandfather kept excellent records, Jake said. And I've been through everything. There's no easement agreement. Then perhaps it was filed with the county, Richard suggested. I'll have my attorney send over copies of all relevant documents. In the meantime, I trust you won't do anything to disrupt our community. We have families here, people who have invested significant money in their homes specifically because of the lake access. There was something almost threatening in the way he said it, like Jake was the bad guy here for questioning why there were millions of dollars worth of structures built on his private property. Jake left the community center feeling overwhelmed and angry. He'd come here expecting to spend a peaceful week remembering his grandfather and planning for the future. Instead, he'd walked into some kind of nightmare where an entire luxury neighborhood was apparently squatting on his land. He spent the rest of the day at the county records office, searching through every document related to his property, and Richard Patterson was wrong. There was no easement agreement. There had been one, but it was temporary and had expired 12 years ago. According to the paperwork, it was never renewed. These people had been trespassing on his land for over a decade, building permanent structures, and selling homes based on access they didn't legally have. And from the way Richard had talked, they had no intention of acknowledging the problem. Jake sat in his truck that evening, watching the sunset over the lake, and realized this was going to be a fight. His grandfather had protected this land his whole life, turning down developers and standing firm against people who wanted to profit from it. Now it was Jake's turn to do the same. He just had no idea how ugly things were about to get. Jake spent 3 days doing research before making his next move. He wanted to handle this the right way, professionally and legally. Despite how angry he was about the situation, he understood that many of the homeowners probably had no idea they'd been lied to about the lake access. They'd trusted the developer and the HOA board, and now they were caught in the middle of something that wasn't their fault. So he drafted a letter explaining the situation. He kept it respectful but clear. The lake was on his property, the easement had expired years ago, and all the structures built on his land were unauthorized. He proposed a meeting with the HOA board to discuss a solution that would work for everyone. Maybe they could negotiate a new easement agreement with proper terms and fair compensation. Jake even offered to meet with individual homeowners who had questions. He sent the letter via certified mail to make sure Richard Patterson couldn't claim he never received it. Then he waited for a response. A week went by, nothing. 2 weeks. Still nothing. Jake called the HOA office and left 3 messages. None of them were returned. It was becoming clear that Richard Patterson had no intention of negotiating. He was probably hoping Jake would just go away, or maybe he thought if he ignored the problem long enough it would somehow resolve itself. But Jake wasn't going anywhere, and the problem was definitely real. On day 17, Jake got a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Jake Morrison?" A woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Catherine Chen. I'm an attorney specializing in property rights. I heard through some contacts at the county office that you might need legal help with a situation involving an HOA. Jake's first instinct was to be suspicious. How did you get my number? Public record from the deed transfer, she said. Look, I know this seems like a cold call, but I've handled cases like yours before. HOAs that overreach, property disputes, easement issues. I'd like to help if you're interested. They met for coffee the next day. Catherine was in her 40s, sharp and direct in a way that Jake appreciated. She didn't waste time with small talk. Tell me everything, she said, pulling out a legal pad. Jake laid out the whole situation. The inheritance, the discovery of the unauthorized structures, the expired easement, Richard Patterson's refusal to communicate. Catherine took notes and asked pointed questions about dates, documents, and specific conversations. When he finished, she sat back and whistled low. Okay, this is worse than I thought, but also better in a weird way. What do you mean? Worse because these people have been trespassing on your land for over a decade and have probably caused significant damage to the property value and ecosystem. Better because you have a clear-cut case. The easement expired. They never renewed it. They never got your grandfather's permission for the permanent structures. Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on. Jake felt a weight lift off his chest. So what do we do? First, I need to verify everything at the county office. Then we send a more formal legal notice to the HOA demanding they respond within 30 days. If they continue to ignore us, we can pursue legal action. I don't want to sue anybody, Jake said. I just want them to acknowledge the problem and work out a fair solution. Catherine smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. Jake, I appreciate that you're trying to be reasonable. But from what you've told me about Richard Patterson, he's not going to negotiate unless he's forced to. People like him are used to bullying their way through problems. He probably thinks you're some kid he can intimidate. So what's he going to do when he realizes I'm not going away? That's what worries me, Catherine said. When people like Richard feel cornered, they tend to do stupid things. She had no idea how right she was. Jake went back home to the city, trying to focus on his regular job while Catherine handled the legal paperwork. She confirmed everything he'd found at the county office. The easement had definitely expired. There was no renewal on record. She sent a formal legal notice to the HOA with a 30-day deadline to respond. 28 days later, Jake got a call from Catherine. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. Jake, I need you to sit down for this. His stomach dropped. What happened? The HOA didn't just ignore our legal notice. They went on the offensive. I just got served with paperwork claiming that you're in violation of property tax law. What? That's impossible. I paid the inheritance taxes through the estate. I know you did. But apparently during the probate process, there was a quarterly property tax payment that got missed. It was probably just a clerical error during the transition, and you were in the process of getting it sorted out. But Jake, the HOA somehow got wind of it and they moved fast. What does that mean? Catherine's voice was grim. It means they purchased the tax lien on your property, and they've already initiated foreclosure proceedings. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. They can do that? Technically, yes. When property taxes go unpaid, the county can put a lien on the property and eventually auction it off to recover the debt. But there are supposed to be safeguards. Proper notification to the property owner, a reasonable redemption period where you can pay the back taxes and keep your land. Jake, I've looked at the paperwork. Something's not right here. Not right how? The timeline is wrong. You should have received multiple notices about the unpaid taxes. You should have had months to resolve this. Instead, it looks like everything was fast-tracked. The lien was purchased and the foreclosure process was initiated in a matter of weeks. I've never seen anything move this fast. Can they actually take my land? They're trying to. There's an auction scheduled for next week. Jake felt panic rising in his chest. An auction? For my 1,500 acres? For $47,000 in back taxes and fees. Jake, I'm already drafting an emergency motion to stop this. Something illegal is happening here. I can feel it. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Catherine dug into every detail of the tax lien purchase and the foreclosure process. And the more she dug, the more problems she found. The notification that should have been sent to Jake's address had been mailed to the old ranch address, where his grandfather had lived alone. No one was there to receive it. The redemption period, which should have been 6 months according to state law, had somehow been shortened to 6 weeks. And the auction had been announced in a tiny legal notice in a newspaper that barely anyone read, published exactly once on a random Tuesday. "This reeks of corruption," Catherine told him. "Richard Patterson has connections at the county level. I think he called in favors to rush this through before you could respond. Can we stop it?" "I'm trying. But Jake, the legal system moves slowly. Even with an emergency motion, I don't know if we can get a hearing before the auction date." The day of the auction, Jake drove out to the county courthouse with Catherine. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Everything his grandfather had worked for, everything he'd protected for 40 years, was about to be sold off for less than the price of a new car. They arrived an hour before the auction was scheduled to start. The courthouse steps were empty except for two people: Richard Patterson, looking smug in an expensive suit, and a man Jake didn't recognize, probably his attorney. Well, Richard said when he saw them. "Mr. Morrison, I'm surprised to see you here. Most people don't bother showing up to watch their property get sold." Jake stepped toward him, but Catherine put a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's what he wants." "You know this is illegal," Jake said, his voice shaking with anger. "You manipulated the system. You rushed this through before I had a chance to respond." Richard shrugged. "I don't know what you're talking about. All I know is that property taxes weren't paid, and the law allows for tax lien sales. If you'd been more responsible with your inheritance, we wouldn't be in this situation. You stole my notification. You shortened the redemption period. You're corrupt." "Those are serious accusations," Richard said, and now his voice had an edge to it. "I'd be careful about what you say in front of witnesses. Slander is actionable." The auction itself took less than 10 minutes. Only Richard and his attorney were there to bid. The auctioneer, a bored county clerk who clearly didn't understand or care about what was happening, started the bidding at $47,000. Richard raised his hand. No one else bid. Going once, going twice, sold. Just like that, Jake's inheritance was gone. Catherine immediately filed appeals and motions, but Jake barely heard her explanations. He was numb. He'd lost everything. His grandfather's legacy, the land that had been in his family for 40 years, the lake where he'd learned to swim as a kid. All of it stolen by a corrupt HOA president who saw Jake as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. 3 days later, Jake received an eviction notice in the mail. It was from the Lakeside Estates HOA, signed by Richard Patterson. It informed Jake that he was trespassing on HOA property and had 30 days to remove himself and any belongings. The letter ended with a line that made Jake's blood boil. "We appreciate your cooperation in this matter and wish you well in your future endeavors." Jake sat in his apartment, staring at that letter, and felt something shift inside him. He'd tried to be reasonable. He'd tried to negotiate. He'd tried to do everything the right way. And in return, he'd been cheated. Catherine worked like someone possessed. She filed motions, gathered evidence, and interviewed everyone from county clerks to the auctioneer who'd sold Jake's property. Jake had maxed out 2 credit cards and taken a loan against his car to pay her legal fees, but he didn't care. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice. The appeal hearing was scheduled for 8 months after the auction. 8 months of Jake barely sleeping, jumping every time his phone rang, wondering if this was really happening. 8 months of Richard Patterson sending smug letters through his attorney, reminding Jake that he was trespassing on HOA property and threatening additional legal action if he didn't comply with the eviction notice. Jake ignored the threats. Catherine had advised him that while the appeal was pending, the eviction couldn't be enforced. It was a legal gray area, but it bought them time. During those 8 months, Catherine built her case piece by piece. She discovered that Richard Patterson had called the county tax assessor 17 times in the 3 weeks before the auction. She found an email where Richard asked specifically about expediting the tax lien process. Most damaging of all, she uncovered that Richard had personally visited the county office the day before Jake's notification letter was supposed to be mailed, and somehow that letter had been sent to the wrong address. "This is enough," Catherine told Jake during one of their weekly meetings. "This proves corruption. This proves the auction should never have happened. But will the judge agree?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Judges don't like to overturn official county actions. It makes the system look bad. But we have a strong case." The hearing finally arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in February. Jake wore the only suit he owned, which he'd bought for his grandfather's funeral. Catherine was there with 3 boxes of evidence and a presentation that she'd rehearsed until Jake could recite it in his sleep. Richard Patterson showed up with 2 attorneys from one of the biggest law firms in the state. That's when Jake realized how much money the HOA was pouring into this fight. Richard wasn't just defending his own actions anymore. He was protecting the entire Lakeside Estates community, and they had deep pockets. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Catherine presented her evidence, showing the timeline irregularities, the suspicious phone calls, the mysteriously misrouted notification letter. She argued that Jake had been systematically denied his legal rights to proper notification and a fair redemption period. Richard's attorneys argued that every step had followed proper legal procedure. If there were any irregularities, they were simple administrative errors, not evidence of corruption. They painted Jake as an irresponsible property owner who'd failed to pay his taxes and was now trying to blame others for his mistakes. Judge Martinez listened to everything, took notes, asked pointed questions. Jake couldn't read her expression at all. She was probably in her 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through everyone's arguments to the truth underneath. At the end of the day, she announced she'd issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Jake's life. He couldn't focus on work. He couldn't sleep. He just waited. When the ruling came, Catherine called him immediately. "Jake, we won." He couldn't breathe for a second. "What?" "The judge ruled that the auction was invalid. She found that your due process rights were violated through multiple procedural irregularities that could not be explained by simple administrative error. She's voiding the sale and returning the property to you." Jake felt tears running down his face before he even realized he was crying. "I get it back? I get the land back? You get it all back." The judge was actually pretty harsh in her ruling. She said the evidence suggested deliberate manipulation of the tax lien process and strongly recommended that the county attorney investigate for possible criminal conduct. "What about Richard?" Catherine's voice went hard. "He's not going to face criminal charges. There's not quite enough evidence for that, and people with his connections rarely see jail time anyway. But Jake, the ruling destroys his entire defense. It proves that the HOA never had legitimate claim to your property. So what happens now? Now we go on offense." Over the next week, Catherine explained the full scope of what Jake could do now that he had his property back. And once she laid it all out, Jake understood why Richard had been so desperate to steal the land through the auction. Every single one of those 47 mansions in Lakeside Estates had been sold with false information. The real estate listings, the sales brochures, the marketing materials, all of them advertised guaranteed lake access. They showed pictures of the lake, the docks, the beach pavilion. Buyers had paid premium prices, $8 to $12 million per home, specifically because of that lake access. But legally, they'd never had it. The original easement had expired 12 years ago. When the developer sold those homes, he was committing fraud. And when the HOA continued to use the lake and build structures on it, they were trespassing. Every homeowner who bought property in Lakeside Estates has a legitimate claim against the developer for fraud, Catherine explained. But the developer's company dissolved years ago. The assets were distributed, the LLC was closed. There's no one to sue anymore except the people who continued the fraud, which is the HOA board. "And Richard specifically," Jake said. "And Richard specifically. As HOA president, he knew or should have known that the easement had expired. He had a legal duty to inform the homeowners. Instead, he kept quiet, kept using your property, and tried to steal it outright when you showed up." Jake sat with this information for a long time. He thought about his grandfather, who'd always said that the land would take care of those who took care of it. He thought about Richard Patterson's smug face at the auction. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything. "What are my options?" he finally asked. Catherine pulled out a document she'd prepared. Legally, you could pursue several different paths. You could sue the HOA for damages from 12 years of unauthorized use. You could sue each individual homeowner for trespassing. You could demand they remove all structures from your property immediately. Or you could negotiate a settlement. What would you do? She looked at him directly. "Jake, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen a lot of property disputes. And here's what I've learned. Sometimes the best revenge is forcing people to face the consequences of their own actions. Richard Patterson tried to destroy you. He manipulated the legal system, stole your property, and tried to intimidate you into walking away. If you hit back hard enough, you won't just get justice. You'll make sure he never does this to anyone else. Jake thought about the homeowners, the regular people who'd bought those houses believing they were getting what they paid for. They were victims too, in a way, but they'd also benefited from using his property illegally for years. They'd enjoyed that lake, those docks, that beach, all while paying nothing for the privilege. "Tell me the hardest thing I can legally do," Jake said. Catherine smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "The hardest thing? File liens against every single property in Lakeside Estates for the fair market value of unauthorized lake access over the past 12 years, with interest. How much are we talking about?" "I'd need to hire an appraiser, but based on comparable lakefront property rental values in this area, probably around $340,000 per property. Multiply that by 47 homes and you're looking at roughly $16 million in liens." Jake felt dizzy. That would bankrupt most of them. It would. The liens would attach to their properties. They couldn't sell or refinance until the liens were satisfied. Some of them might be forced into foreclosure. It would be devastating for the community. Would it be legal? Completely legal. You'd be seeking fair compensation for unauthorized use of your property. Any property owner would have the same right. Jake stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city looked normal. People going about their lives having no idea that one person's decision could change everything for 47 families. Is there another option? You could offer a settlement. Negotiate a permanent easement agreement with reasonable terms. Make them pay fair market value for access going forward, plus compensation for past use. It would be less devastating but still expensive for them. And Richard Patterson, that's a separate issue. You could pursue individual damages against him for the auction fraud, the legal fees you incurred, emotional distress. Make him personally responsible for what he did. Jake turned back to her. Do both. File the liens against all the properties. But offer them a settlement path. They can either pay the full amount, or they can pay a reduced easement fee plus my legal costs. Give them a choice. And Richard? Him I want to destroy. Catherine nodded slowly. Okay, but Jake, you need to understand something. When we do this, we're declaring war. Richard Patterson has money, connections, and pride. He's not going to accept defeat easily. This is going to get ugly. He already made it ugly when he stole my property. I'm just finishing what he started. The paperwork took 3 weeks to prepare. Catherine hired an appraiser who confirmed that the fair market value for lake access in the area was substantial. She drafted individual lien notices for all 47 properties. She prepared a settlement offie. 3 months after filing the liens, Jake made his first visit back to Lakeside Estates. He wasn't sure what to expect. Angry confrontations, maybe? Security trying to throw him out. But when he pulled up to the lake, everything looked weirdly normal. A few boats on the water, some kids playing at the beach pavilion, the dock still standing like nothing had changed, except everything had changed. He walked down to the shore and just stood there looking at the water. This lake had been part of his family for 40 years. His grandfather had protected it, kept it clean, turned down millions of dollars to keep it wild. And for 12 years, these people had used it like it was theirs. Built on it, changed it, claimed it. You must be Jake Morrison. He turned to find a woman in her 30s standing behind him. She had tired eyes and a baby on her hip. Yeah, that's me. I'm Lisa Chen. My husband and I bought our house here 4 years ago. She shifted the baby to her other hip. We're one of the families that settled with you. Paid the $85,000 for the easement. Jake tensed, waiting for the anger, but she just looked sad. I wanted to tell you something, she said. We didn't know. About the easement being expired, about the lake not being part of the HOA property. When we bought our house, everything said we had guaranteed lake access. That's why we spent $9 million on a place here. For our kids. I know, Jake said quietly. I know most people didn't know. Richard Patterson should have told us. The board should have told us. Instead, they kept quiet and let us believe everything was fine. She looked out at the lake. We're suing them, you know. The whole board. A lot of us are. I heard. My husband wanted me to hate you, Lisa said. But I don't. You're just trying to protect what's yours. Richard Patterson's the one who created this mess. After she left, Jake sat on the beach for a long time, thinking about everything Catherine had explained to him over the past few weeks. The legal situation was complicated, but the human situation was even messier. 47 families lived in Lakeside Estates. Some of them, like Lisa Chen and her husband, were victims of fraud who'd paid millions for houses believing they came with lake access. But others had been there longer, had known the original developer, might have suspected something wasn't right but chose not to ask questions because it benefited them. And then there was Richard Patterson. Catherine had done deep research on Richard, and what she'd found was enlightening. He'd been on the HOA board since the beginning, 15 years ago. He'd been friends with the original developer. When that developer's company dissolved, Richard had taken over as HOA president and had been running Lakeside Estates ever since. More interesting, Catherine had found emails between Richard and the developer from 12 years ago, right when the easement expired. The developer had written, "We need to renew the lake access with the old man or find another solution." Richard had responded, "Don't worry about it. He's 80 years old and doesn't even know the easement expired. By the time there's a problem, he'll be gone and we'll deal with whoever inherits. Possession is 9/10 of the law." That email alone proved Richard had knowingly allowed the entire community to trespass on Jake's grandfather's property for over a decade. He'd bet that the old man would die before it became an issue, and he'd been almost right. "We can use this," Catherine had told Jake. "This proves intentional fraud. This proves he knew and deliberately concealed it from the homeowners." Now sitting on the beach, Jake understood the full scope of what Richard had done. He hadn't just tried to steal Jake's property. He'd built an entire community on a foundation of lies, let people invest millions of dollars based on false promises, and then tried to cover it all up by stealing the land when someone finally questioned it. Jake pulled out his phone and called Catherine. "I want to hit him harder, define harder, everything we discussed. I want to pursue maximum damages against him personally. I want his financial records subpoenaed. I want to know exactly how much money he made from this scheme. Jake, we're already suing him for $2 million. How much harder do you want to go?" "As hard as legally possible. He tried to destroy my life. He manipulated the system. He committed fraud against his own neighbors. I want him to face real consequences, not just write a check and walk away." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Okay, but I need you to understand something. What you're talking about could bankrupt him. It could destroy his life. Are you prepared for that?" Jake thought about his grandfather, working that ranch for 40 years. He thought about being served with eviction papers for his own property. He thought about maxing out credit cards to fight for what was rightfully his while Richard Patterson lived in a mansion built on lies. "Yes," Jake said, "I'm prepared for that." The expanded lawsuit Catherine filed 2 weeks later was devastating in its detail. It outlined every email, every phone call, every decision Richard had made to conceal the easement problem. It calculated exactly how much money Richard had saved the HOA by not negotiating a proper easement renewal. It showed that Richard personally owned the largest property in Lakeside Estates worth $12 million and had benefited more than anyone from the illegal lake access. The lawsuit sought $5 million in damages, plus disgorgement of profits, plus punitive damages for fraud and malicious conduct. Richard's response was to double down. He filed a motion claiming Jake was engaged in harassment and abuse of the legal system. He gave interviews to local news outlets painting himself as a victim of an unreasonable landowner trying to extort an entire community. He organized a PR campaign, posting on social media about property rights and government overreach. But his narrative fell apart when the local newspaper got hold of that 12-year-old email. The one where Richard said he'd just wait for Jake's grandfather to die and deal with the inheritance later. Once that became public, any sympathy for Richard evaporated. The homeowners' class action lawsuit expanded. More families joined. They weren't just going after Richard anymore. They were demanding he pay restitution for the difference between what they'd paid for their homes and what they were actually worth without guaranteed lake access. That added up to millions more in potential damages. Richard's attorneys tried everything. They filed motion after motion, trying to get cases dismissed, trying to separate the lawsuits, trying to find any procedural escape hatch. But Catherine and the other attorneys had built their cases too well. Every motion was denied. 4 months after Jake had filed the lien, settlement talks finally began. But not with Jake. The HOA's new board, led by people who'd only recently been elected after the previous board was forced to resign, reached out through their attorney. Jake met with them at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown office building. There were 5 board members, all of them looking exhausted and stressed. The new HOA president, David Park, spoke first. "Mr. Morrison, we want to apologize. The previous board, led by Richard Patterson, created this situation through fraud and deception. The current board and the vast majority of homeowners had no knowledge of the easement issue. We're victims of his lies just like you are." Jake nodded but didn't say anything. David continued, "We understand you have every legal right to enforce these liens. You own the property and we've been trespassing. But we're asking you to consider a settlement that would allow our community to survive. Many of these families have children. They've invested their life savings in these homes. If all the liens are enforced, dozens of families will face foreclosure and financial ruin." "What are you proposing?" Jake asked. The HOA's attorney laid out their offer. The HOA would pay Jake's legal fees in full, which had now climbed to over $200,000. Each homeowner would purchase a permanent easement for lake access at $85,000 per property, creating a fund of just under $4 million. The homeowners who'd already settled would have their payments count toward this total. In exchange, Jake would release all claims against the HOA and the individual homeowners. The liens would be removed. The community could move forward. "What about Richard Patterson?" Jake asked. "He's not part of this agreement," David said. "Your lawsuit against him personally continues. We're not protecting him. In fact, our class action against him continues as well." Jake looked at Catherine. She gave a small nod. They'd discussed this possibility. "I want one more thing," Jake said. "What's that?" "I want the money from the easements to go into a conservation trust in my grandfather's name. The land stays protected. No development, no expansion of the HOA boundaries, no additional structures on the lake. And I want a formal acknowledgement from the HOA that this entire situation was caused by the previous board's fraud, specifically naming Richard Patterson." The board members looked at each other. David nodded. "We can agree to that." They finalized the settlement over the next 3 weeks. 42 homeowners paid for their easements, some taking out loans, some liquidating investments. 5 holdout families tried to fight it, but eventually caved when they realized their property values would never recover with the liens in place. The Heritage Land Trust was established with just under $4 million in funding. Jake's grandfather's name was engraved on a plaque at the lake, along with a full explanation of his 40 years of SDE. The criminal investigation into Richard Patterson moved faster than anyone expected. Once the state attorney general's office saw the evidence of embezzlement, they expanded their investigation. What they found was stunning even to Catherine, who'd been dealing with this case for over a year. Richard had been systematically stealing from the HOA for nearly a decade. He'd hidden it well, buried in complex accounting and legitimate-looking expenses. But once investigators started pulling the thread, the whole scheme unraveled. Over $800,000 in HOA funds had been diverted to pay for his personal expenses, legal fees, and even improvements to his own property. The homeowners were devastated all over again. Not only had Richard lied about the lake access, not only had he tried to steal Jake's property, but he'd been robbing them blind the entire time he was supposed to be protecting their interests. Jake watched it all unfold from a strange emotional distance. He'd won. The liens were settled. His property was secure, the conservation trust was established. Richard was facing potential prison time and financial ruin. Justice, by any objective measure, had been served. So why did Jake feel so empty? He was sitting in his apartment one evening, going through legal documents when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Jake Morrison?" a man's voice said. It was hoarse, defeated. "Yeah, who's this?" "It's Richard Patterson." Jake's hand tightened on the phone. Catherine had specifically told him never to speak directly to Richard without her present. But curiosity got the better of him. "You're not supposed to be calling me." "I know. I needed to say something, and I couldn't do it through lawyers." Jake waited. "I destroyed my life," Richard said. "My wife left me. My kids won't talk to me. I'm going to lose my house, probably go to prison. Everything I built over 30 years is gone." "You did that to yourself," Jake said, his voice hard. "You tried to steal my property. You lied to your neighbors. You embezzled from people who trusted you. I know. I know all of that. And you're right. I deserve everything that's happening to me." Richard's voice cracked. But I need you to understand something. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When the easement expired, I thought I could just handle it quietly, get it renewed without anyone noticing. But the old man, your grandfather, he wouldn't take my calls. And then years passed and it became this thing I couldn't fix without admitting I'd screwed up. So you decided to steal my land instead? I panicked. When you showed up asking questions, I saw everything falling apart. The property values, the lawsuits, my reputation. I thought if I could just get control of the land, I could make it all go away. Jake almost hung up, but something in Richard's voice stopped him. It wasn't an excuse or a justification. It was just a broken man admitting he'd ruined his life through his own choices. Why are you telling me this? Jake asked. Because you won. Completely. And I guess I needed you to know that I understand that. I'm not calling to ask for mercy or to negotiate anything. I just wanted to say that you were right and I was wrong, and I'm sorry for what I tried to do to you. Richard hung up before Jake could respond. Jake sat there for a long time staring at his phone. He'd wanted Richard to suffer, wanted him to lose everything, wanted him to face real consequences. And now that it was happening, Jake didn't feel the satisfaction he'd expected. He just felt tired. He called Catherine and told her about the phone call. He violated the no-contact order by calling you. She said immediately, "We could use that against him." "I don't want to," Jake said. "What?" "I don't want to use it against him. Catherine, he's done. He's losing his house, his family, probably going to prison. What more do we need to take from him?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Jake, after everything he did to you, you're willing to just let this go?" "I'm not letting anything go. He's facing consequences, big ones. I just don't need to keep twisting the knife." The settlements were finalized over the next 2 months. The homeowner's class action against Richard was settled for $3 million, which Richard couldn't possibly pay. His house, the $12 million mansion that had been the largest in Lakeside Estates, was put up for foreclosure auction to satisfy the judgment. Jake's personal lawsuit was settled for $500,000, with Richard agreeing to a payment plan that would probably take him the rest of his life to fulfill. The criminal embezzlement charges resulted in Richard pleading guilty to avoid trial. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. Richard Patterson, who'd once been the king of Lakeside Estates, lost everything. His house sold at auction for $8 million, well below its previous value. His wife divorced him and got custody of their kids. His business partnerships dissolved. When he went to prison, he went as a broken man who'd destroyed his own life through arrogance and greed. And Jake? He was sitting at the lake one afternoon watching the sunset when David Park from the HOA board came to find him. "We wanted to invite you to the community meeting next week," David said. "We're voting on some new bylaws for lake access and environmental protection. We thought you should be there." "I'm not part of your community," Jake said, "maybe not technically, but this is your land. And we're only here because you chose to let us be. That makes you part of this, whether you like it or not." Jake went to the meeting expecting tension or hostility. Instead, he found something unexpected: gratitude. The homeowners had established a lake stewardship committee to ensure the water stayed clean and the ecosystem stayed healthy. They'd implemented strict rules about boats, fishing, and noise to minimize environmental impact. They'd even organized volunteer days where residents helped clear invasive species and maintain the shoreline. Lisa Chen, the woman with the baby Jake had met months ago, had become the committee chair. "We want to do right by this land," she told the group. "Not because we have to legally, but because Mr. Morrison gave us a second chance when he could have destroyed us. We owe it to him and to his grandfather's memory to be better stewards than we were before." Jake felt something shift in his chest. The anger and hurt that had been driving him for over a year started to ease. These people weren't his enemies. Most of them had been victims of Richard's fraud just like he had been. And now they were trying to honor his grandfather's legacy in their own way. The story made national news. Not just the local coverage of the legal battles, but major outlets picked it up. HOA president's fraud scheme leads to criminal charges. Illegal auction voided after year-long legal battle. Community rebuilds after corruption. Scandal. But the most interesting coverage came from an investigative journalist who looked into HOA corruption more broadly. She found that what Richard had done wasn't unique. Across the country, HOAs were accumulating power without oversight, spending homeowners' money without accountability, and in some cases engaging in outright fraud. Jake's case became an example of what could go wrong when HOAs operated without proper checks and balances. 3 states introduced legislation to reform HOA governance based partly on what had happened at Lakeside Estates. The new laws required independent audits of HOA finances, limited the power of HOA boards to purchase tax liens, and created stronger protections for property owners facing foreclosure. Jake was invited to testify before a state legislative committee. He stood in front of a room full of lawmakers and told them about his grandfather, about the land, about watching everything nearly get stolen through corruption and manipulation. "This isn't just about me," he told them. "It's about every property owner who trusts that the system will protect their rights. My grandfather spent 40 years protecting that land. I almost lost it in 40 days because one corrupt man knew how to manipulate the system. We need laws that prevent that from ever happening again." The legislation passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Jake used some of the settlement money to establish a legal defense fund for property owners fighting HOA overreach. Catherine helped him set it up, and it quickly became a resource for people facing situations similar to what Jake had gone through. The Heritage Land Trust that Jake had established, with the easement payments, became a model for conservation efforts in the region. The $4 million was invested wisely, generating enough income to maintain the property, fund environmental research, and support conservation education programs. Jake built a small cabin on the property, far from the lake where he could spend weekends. He kept his job in the city but found himself driving out to the land more and more often. It became his refuge, the place where he could think and heal and remember his grandfather. One afternoon, almost 2 years after everything had started, Jake was sitting by the lake when he saw a familiar figure walking toward him. It took him a moment to recognize Richard Patterson. The man had lost weight. His hair had gone gray, and he moved like someone much older than his 60-some years. "I'm out," Richard said without preamble. "Serve my sentence minus a few months for good behavior." Jake didn't know what to say. "I just wanted to see the place one more time," Richard continued. "The lake. I used to come here every morning when I lived in the neighborhood. It was the best part of my day." He looked out at the water with an expression that might have been grief.